Thank you for joining us for another edition of From the Pastor's Journal. And today's thought is knowing God's power and seeing His glory. The scripture that I actually read as related to this thought was Psalm 63, verses 1 and 2. And the psalmist said, "Oh God, you are my God. I seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Thus I have seen you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory." At first glance, we can already see that this author has made God his priority. He has made the claim, "God, you are my God." And in this declaration, when he made this declaration, he was saying from the commandments, "I will have no other gods before you." So I ask myself, and I challenge you to ask yourself, do you long to know God more? Do you long to know His power and His glory? We live in a day where many people know about God. Often they even curse His name, but they truly don't know God. In Psalm 18, the writer reveals a person who is going through a difficult time. His first words were, "In my distress, I called upon the Lord and cried to my God for help." Then he says, "He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry for help before him came into my ears." The promise and blessing that we see here in this verse is that he heard my voice and he heard my cry for help. I want to ask you again, think about this. What promises do you remember God has made to you? Can you think back something you've prayed for and you believe that God spoke to you and said, "Hey, I'm going to bless you in this specific area in your life"? I had written in my journal a few things, and here are the things that I feel that God had promised me. I know that I'm called into ministry, called to preach the gospel, and His promise to me and my family is if I am obedient, I preach the gospel, that He will provide for me and my family. Another thing I remember Him saying to me in the moment that He actually called me into abundant life and abundant living, He said, "If you give me your life, JD, I will use you for my glory." That's a promise He made, and I'm trusting Him for that. And then finally, as it relates to being a pastor, and a pastor who would like to see his church blossom and grow, God spoke to me and said, there's a harvest of people waiting at the door, and I'm waiting for you to get alone with me so that I can enlarge your faith to receive the harvest that I have for you. See, I see God's glory and God's power. When we read Romans chapter 8, verse 29, he says that He predestined me to be conformed to His image. He wants me to look like Christ. And then Paul spoke to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 3:18. He says, "I am transformed into His image." It takes something supernatural from God, something divine, to be transformed into His image. And then in Colossians 3:10, it gives some responsibility to the individual who wants to know God more and to see His glory, that experience His power. He says, "I have put on my new self that is being renewed." We aren't immediately perfect in God. We still struggle. We still are frail. We have the propensity to sin. But we can see God's power. We can know God's power, see His glory when we earnestly seek Him. When we do, He will hear us and He will help us. Thank you for joining us. Come back next week for our next journal entry from the Pastor's Journal.